close your eyes. Take a slow breath in and out. You are safe. You are warm. And tonight, I'm going to tell you something that most people are never supposed to know. What you are about to hear is not a bedtime story. It is not mythology. It is not fiction. It is a hidden history of our world, pieced together from ancient religious texts, suppressed archaeological discoveries, government cover-ups, and the oldest myths ever written by human hands. Tonight, we go back, far back, before recorded history, before modern civilization, before the world you and I were born into ever existed. We are going to talk about a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were blurred, when beings of immense power walked among us, when giants, real, breathing, towering giants, ruled the ancient world alongside ordinary humans like you and me. We're going to follow the trail left behind by the Book of Enoch, the Torah, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Vedic scriptures of India, the oral traditions of Native American Paiute people, and the buried records of the Smithsonian Institution, records that were filed away, locked up, and quietly forgotten. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. The evidence was found. The bones were unearthed. The skeletons, some standing nearly 3 meters tall, with double the bone density of a normal human, were cataloged, photographed, and reported in newspapers across America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then they disappeared. Not lost, not misplaced, disappeared. Over 1,000 giant skeletal remains, pulled from the earth between the 1890s and the 1940s across North America. And today, not a single one is on public display. Not one. Tonight, across 8 chapters, we're going to follow the story from the very beginning, from the moment the first watchers descended from the heavens, to the great flood that was meant to erase everything they left behind, and to the haunting question that has never been answered. What if some of them survived? Settle in. Pull your blanket a little closer, because the world you think you know is only the surface. Let us go deeper. Before we begin, I want you to imagine something with me. Picture the night sky as it looked tens of thousands of years ago. No city lights, no pollution, no noise, just an endless ocean of stars stretching from one horizon to the other, so dense and so bright that the Milky Way cast actual shadows on the ground below. Ancient humans would lie on their backs and stare into that sky for hours, for entire lifetimes. And they believed with every part of themselves that something up there was watching them. They were not wrong. In the oldest religious and spiritual traditions of the world, long before the Bible was compiled, long before the Torah was written down in its final form, and long before the great empires of Mesopotamia rose from the riverbanks of the Tigris and Euphrates, there existed a text, a very old text, one that the early church fathers debated, including the Bible, and ultimately decided to suppress. A text so uncomfortable, so specific, and so detailed in its descriptions of what happened before the flood that powerful institutions have spent centuries arguing over whether ordinary people should ever be allowed to read it. That text is called the Book of Enoch, and tonight we begin there. Enoch, according to ancient tradition, was a man who walked so closely with God that he was taken from the earth without ever tasting death. He was the great-grandfather of Noah, and according to the book that bears his name, he was also the first human being to receive a complete account of what had happened in the ages before his own. The angels spoke to him, the heavens opened to him, and what he saw and what he was told was written down in extraordinary detail that has survived thousands of years of attempted erasure. So, what did Enoch tell us? He told us about a group of celestial beings known as the Watchers. The Watchers, in the tradition of Enoch, were not ordinary angels. They were not the winged messengers most of us picture when we hear that word. They were something older, something more complex, and something far more powerful. They were described as a class of divine beings whose specific purpose was to observe, to watch over the earth and its people, to monitor the development of humanity from above, and report back to the higher authority, to God, to the Creator, to whatever name you choose to give to the ultimate source of all things. They were, in the most precise sense of the word, guardians. And for an unimaginably long period of time, they fulfilled that role. They watched from a distance. They observed the slow crawl of human civilization. They saw tribes form and scatter. They saw the first fires lit in the darkness. They saw the first words carved into stone. They saw love and grief and war, and laughter playing out on the surface of the earth below them. And they watched, and they waited, and they remained apart. But something changed. The book of Enoch describes a moment with a weight that is almost unbearable in its simplicity. It says that the watchers looked down at the daughters of men, the women of the earth, and they found them beautiful. Not just beautiful in a passing, distant way, beautiful in a way that reached inside them and pulled at something they were never supposed to feel. A longing, a desire, a hunger that their divine nature had no framework for. And 200 of them made a decision. 200 watchers gathered on the summit of a mountain. The book of Enoch calls it Mount Hermon. And there, they made a pact with each other. They swore an oath together, binding themselves to one another, because each of them individually was afraid that, if he descended alone, he would be the only one punished. So they swore together. They committed together. And then, in an act that would ultimately set in motion the destruction of an entire world, they descended. They left their posts. They abandoned their stations. They came down to earth, and they took human women as their wives. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to hear this and picture something fantastical, something from a movie, glowing figures floating down from the clouds and introducing themselves to startled women in fields. But the reality suggested by these ancient texts is far more nuanced and far more unsettling than that. Think about the power dynamic here. These were beings of immense knowledge. The book of Enoch is very specific about what the Watchers knew. They understood astronomy at a level that would not be rediscovered by mainstream science for thousands of years. They understood mathematics, celestial mechanics, the movements of stars and planets, and the forces that govern the physical world. They understood herbalism and medicine, and the secrets of the Earth's own chemistry. They understood metallurgy, how to pull metals from the ground, and reshape them into tools and weapons. They understood agriculture at its deepest level. They understood the arts of war, the crafting of shields and swords and battle strategies. And perhaps most significantly, they understood the hidden sciences, the knowledge of signs and omens, what we might today call the occult sciences, things that in the ancient world would have looked like nothing short of magic. And they shared all of this with humans. The book of Enoch lists the Watchers by name and assigns each of them a specific body of knowledge that they transmitted to humanity. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He taught women the art of cosmetics and ornamentation, how to beautify themselves, how to paint their eyes, how to adorn themselves with jewels. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezequiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Araquiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamziel taught the signs of the sun. And Serial taught the course of the moon. This was not casual knowledge sharing. This was a complete and systematic transfer of advanced understanding from a non-human civilization to an early human one. And the book of Enoch is very clear about the consequences of that transfer. It says that as men learned to make weapons, violence spread across the earth. As women learned to beautify themselves, desire and jealousy and lust spread through human communities. As people gained access to knowledge they were not yet mature enough to handle responsibly, the entire social fabric of the world began to unravel, because knowledge without wisdom is not a gift. It is a weapon. And there is one more layer to this story that I need you to understand, because it changes everything. The Watchers did not only share their knowledge, they also had children. These unions between the Watchers and human women produced offspring. And those offspring were something that the world had never seen before and has not seen since, at least not in the numbers that existed then. They were not fully divine. They were not fully human. They were something in between, something enormous, something powerful beyond imagination, something that the ancient texts call the Nephilim. But before we talk about the Nephilim, before we talk about the giants who walked this earth and left their footprints in the stone and their bones in the ground, I want you to breathe for a moment, because the story of the Watchers is not just an ancient myth. It is a story about what happens when power without accountability meets a world that is not ready for it. It is a story about the temptation of knowledge, about the seduction of the forbidden, about 200 beings who looked down at a beautiful world and said, "We want to be part of it." without stopping to ask what the cost of that desire might be. The Watchers came down from their mountain, and the world was never the same again. Close your eyes and let that settle. Picture them, those 200 figures, standing on the peak of Mount Hermon as the stars burn above them, making their oath. Imagine the silence of that moment, the gravity of it, the point of no return. They were guardians who chose to become participants, and in doing so, they set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately require the creator of the universe to press a reset button on the entire human world. That reset had a name. You already know it. But first, let's meet the children. Let me take you somewhere. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine a village. A small ancient settlement somewhere in the fertile lands between two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. In a time so far removed from our own that the very stars above look slightly different than the ones you see tonight. The people in this village are small by our standards. They are lean and sun-darkened and strong in the way that people who work the land every day of their lives become strong. They build their homes from mud brick. They keep goats and cattle. They grind grain by hand. They tell stories around fires at night. They are, in every meaningful sense of the word, ordinary. And then one morning, a child is born that is not ordinary at all. The mother has been carrying this child longer than any woman in the village has ever carried a child before. And when the birth finally comes, the midwives go silent, not because something is wrong, but because something is profoundly, impossibly different. The child is larger than any newborn anyone has ever seen. Its eyes, according to some ancient descriptions, are unusual, bright, penetrating, unsettling in a way that no one can quite articulate. And from the very first weeks of its life, it grows at a rate that makes the other children in the village look like they are standing still. This is the beginning of the Nephilim. The word itself is one of the most debated terms in all of ancient linguistics. In Hebrew, the root of the word Nephilim connects to the concept of falling, from the verb naphal, meaning to fall. So the Nephilim are, in the most literal etymological sense, the fallen ones, or the ones who cause others to fall, or the ones who descended. Scholars have argued about this for centuries, and they continue to argue about it today, because the word carries within it multiple layers of meaning that resist being collapsed into a single clean translation. But here is what the texts agree on. The Nephilim were the children of the Watchers and human women. They were hybrids, carrying within their DNA, if we want to use a modern word, both the divine and the mortal. And the physical result of that combination was staggering. The Book of Enoch tells us that the Nephilim grew to enormous heights. Various ancient sources give different numbers. 300 cubits in some wildly exaggerated passages, but in more grounded and frequently cited descriptions, between 3 and 5 meters tall. Now, 5 meters is almost certainly the extreme upper end of a legendary embellishment. But 3 meters, just under 10 feet, that is a number that appears again and again across different texts, different cultures, different continents, and different time periods. And as we will discover later in our story tonight, it is also a number that begins to appear in archaeological records in ways that are very difficult to dismiss. But their physical size was only part of what made the Nephilim so remarkable. And honestly, it may not have even been the most significant part. Remember what their fathers knew. The Watchers had shared their knowledge with humanity. The sciences of the stars, the crafting of weapons, the secrets of the earth. And the children of the Watchers did not merely inherit a portion of this knowledge the way a human child inherits a talent for music or mathematics. They absorbed it completely, deeply, naturally, because it was not learned knowledge for them. It was encoded into their very nature. They understood things that took ordinary humans generations to figure out. They saw patterns in the world that were invisible to everyone around them. They could look at the night sky and read it the way you and I read a page of text. They could work metal with instinctive mastery that appeared, to the people watching them, like something between art and sorcery. And they were enormously, overwhelmingly powerful. Now here's where I want to slow down, because this is a part of the story where it is very easy to slip into a kind of comic book thinking, depicting the Nephilim as movie monsters, as mindless brutes smashing through walls and devouring everything in their path. And while some of the ancient descriptions do lean in that direction, I think that picture misses something important. Something that makes the story of the Nephilim not just frightening, but genuinely tragic. Because the Nephilim were not simply destroyers. At least not at first. In the Torah, in the book of Genesis, the Nephilim are described with a phrase that stops me every time I read it. They are called the heroes of old, the men of renown. These are not words you use for monsters. These are words you use for kings, for warriors, for figures who inspire awe and admiration. And in the ancient Mesopotamian traditions that the Torah draws so heavily from, we see exactly this kind of figure. The demigod who is part divine and part human, who stands at the center of civilization, who builds the great cities, who establishes the laws, who leads armies and constructs temples, and earns a place in the memory of entire peoples for generations. Gilgamesh is the most famous of these figures, the king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. According to the epic that bears his name, one of the oldest pieces of literature ever discovered, he is described as a man of extraordinary physical stature and strength, a builder of great walls, a hero whose exploits filled his people with both terror and pride. He is not presented as evil. He is presented as magnificent and flawed, godlike in his power, deeply human in his suffering. And this, I think, is the key to understanding the Nephilim. They were magnificent and flawed. They had the knowledge of angels and the appetite to humans. They had the power of divine beings and the emotional complexity of creatures who were born into a world that did not entirely know what to do with them. They were worshipped and feared simultaneously. They became rulers naturally, almost inevitably, because when you are 3 meters tall and you understand the stars, and you can forge weapons that no one else can match, the question of who leads is not really a question at all. Ordinary humans did not challenge the Nephilim for leadership. They deferred to them. They served them. They built their myths and their religions around them. And for a while, perhaps for a very long while, this system worked. Or at least it functioned. The Nephilim ruled. Humans served. The knowledge that the Watchers had brought was being applied, however unevenly and however unjustly, to the building of something that resembled civilization. But here's the thing about power without limits. It corrupts, always, without exception. And the greater the power, the more complete the corruption tends to be. The Book of Enoch does not shy away from describing what happened as the Nephilim generations multiplied and their dominance over the earth deepened. It says they consumed everything. It says they ate the labor of humans, and when that was gone, they turned to the humans themselves. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction to tonight's journey, these descriptions carry layers of symbolism that deserve careful unpacking. When the Book of Enoch says the giants ate everything and were still not satisfied, it is not necessarily describing literal cannibalism in every instance, though it does describe that too in certain passages. It is describing something more systemic, and in some ways more terrifying than a single act of violence. It is describing an economic and social reality. The Nephilim, with their superior knowledge and their physical dominance, had positioned themselves at the top of a pyramid. Below them were the humans, farming, laboring, crafting, building, and the fruits of all that human effort flowed upward. The resources of the earth, the food, the metals, the land itself, were controlled by the Nephilim and their families. Humans worked and the Nephilim consumed. And no matter how much was produced, no matter how fertile the harvest or how abundant the herds, the appetite at the top of that pyramid was never satisfied. Because the appetite was not just for food. It was for more, always more. More land, more power, more control, more wealth. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Sit with that for a moment. The Book of Enoch also describes something that I find genuinely chilling in its specificity. It says that the Nephilim, in their hunger, began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. In other words, they were not only exploiting humans, they were extracting every resource the natural world had to offer, consuming without replenishing, taking without giving back, until the very ecosystems of the ancient world began to groan under the weight of their insatiable hunger. The earth itself was being devoured, and as generation followed generation, as the original Nephilim had children of their own who were slightly more human, but still enormous and still powerful, as the culture of dominance became the only culture anyone alive had ever known. Something in the moral fabric of the world began to tear. The violence spread. The Book of Enoch says that the Nephilim turn on each other, different clans, different lineages, competing for the same finite resources. They fought great wars among themselves, Wars that, according to the text, resulted in rivers of blood and the destruction of entire regions. They killed each other. They ate each other. They dragged ordinary humans into their conflicts as soldiers and slaves and casualties, as they always had, as they always would. The world of the Nephilim was a world of staggering beauty and staggering brutality existing side by side. Great cities and great suffering. Monumental architecture and monumental oppression. Advanced knowledge in the hands of beings who had long since lost whatever moral framework might have guided its use. And all of this was happening while the Watchers who had caused it watched from wherever they had retreated to, presumably with something like horror at what their choices had set in motion. Now, in the traditions of multiple ancient civilizations, this era, the era of the Nephilim, the era of demigod kings and giant rulers, is remembered as a kind of golden age gone wrong. In India, the Vedic text described the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, as a time when gods and humans and great beings lived together on the earth. And they say it was the most advanced age humanity has ever known, that the knowledge available then dwarfs anything we have access to today. But they also say that as the ages turned, as power accumulated and corruption spread, that golden age curdled into something dark and violent, setting in motion a long, slow descent through successive ages of increasing spiritual darkness until we arrive at the Kali Yuga, the darkest age, the age of conflict and confusion, the age we are in right now. In Sumer and Akkad, the great civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, the children of the divine beings, the Anunnaki, were likewise remembered as the first kings, the first rulers, the figures who established civilization on Earth. But the Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents ever recovered from the ancient world, describes these early kings in terms that are simply impossible to reconcile with normal human lifespans. Kings who ruled for thousands of years. Kings whose reigns lasted longer than entire modern civilizations, which, if taken literally, suggests either an extraordinary exaggeration or something about the nature of these early rulers that is fundamentally different from what came after them. In Greek mythology, the Titans, the great beings who preceded the Olympian gods, were likewise enormous, powerful, world-shaping figures whose eventual defeat and imprisonment formed the foundation of the current cosmic order. And in the midst of cultures from the Americas to East Asia, from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa, the pattern repeats with an insistence that is very difficult to explain away as coincidence. There was an earlier age. There were greater beings. There was a catastrophe. And what came after was smaller, less powerful, more ordinary. We are the afterword, it seems, to a much longer and more extraordinary story. But here is what I want you to carry with you into sleep tonight, as we close this chapter on the Nephilim, and prepare to move into the story of what finally ended their reign. These beings, whatever we choose to call them, whatever label we assign to them, whether we frame their story in religious language or mythological language, or the emerging language of paleoanthropology, these beings were real, or at the very least, the memory of them is real, preserved in too many places, described in too much consistent detail, across too many cultures that had no known contact with each other, to be simply dismissed as the overactive imagination of our ancestors. They walked this earth, they ruled it, they consumed it, and eventually, something looked down at what had been built and what had been destroyed and made a decision. Enough. Let your breathing slow now. Let the way of the world they lived in settle gently around you like something very old and very heavy and very far away. The Nephilim filled the earth with their power and their hunger and their magnificent, terrible presence. And the sky above them began to gather clouds. I want you to do something for me before we begin this chapter. I want you to forget everything you think you know about ancient humans. Forget the image of primitive cave dwellers huddled around small fires, wrapped in animal skins, communicating in grunts and gestures, stumbling blindly through a world they barely understood. That image, the one that has been fed to us through decades of textbooks and documentaries and museum dioramas, is almost certainly wrong, or at the very least, it is catastrophically incomplete, because the story we are about to explore tonight suggests something far more extraordinary. It suggests that the world which existed before the Great Flood was not a primitive world at all. It was, in many respects, a world that surpassed our own, and then it was erased. Let's begin with what we know, or rather, with what we think we know about the timeline of human civilization. The official narrative, the one taught in schools and universities around the world, tells us that modern human civilization began roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. That before that point, humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers with no permanent settlements, no written language, no complex social structures, no advanced technology. And that everything we think of as civilization, cities, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, governance, art, emerged gradually and relatively recently, in a slow and steady upward climb from simplicity to complexity. This narrative has one very serious problem. The archaeological evidence keeps refusing to cooperate with it. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey was walking across a limestone plateau when he noticed something unusual sticking up from the ground. He called the authorities. Archaeologists arrived, and what they began to uncover over the following years would quietly shatter the established timeline of human civilization, though the full implications of that shattering have still not been absorbed into mainstream understanding. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and it is, by every measure we have, impossible. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of massive stone pillars arranged in elaborate circular formations, covered in intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols, sitting on a hilltop in what is now southern Turkey. The pillars are enormous. Some of them stand more than 5 meters tall and weigh between 10 and 20 tons. They are shaped with a precision and a sophistication that speaks to a level of both engineering knowledge and artistic sensibility that we have no business seeing at the date these structures were built, because Göbekli Tepe has been definitively dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, possibly older, which means it was constructed roughly 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 6,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, at a time when, according to the official narrative, humans were not supposed to be capable of building anything more complex than a simple shelter. And yet there it is, carved from the living rock of a Turkish hillside, assembled with precision that modern engineers study and shake their heads at, decorated with artwork of remarkable sophistication, and then, and this is the detail that haunts me most, deliberately buried, intentionally covered over. Someone, at some point, filled in these incredible structures with earth and rubble and hid them from the world. Not destroyed. Hidden, as if whoever buried them wanted to preserve them for a future that might one day be ready to understand what they meant. Who built Göbekli Tepe? We do not know. The official position is that it was built by nomadic hunter-gatherers, by people with no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no complex social organization. But think about what that actually requires us to believe. It requires us to believe that people with no cities, no surplus food supply, no specialized labor force, and no written means of transmitting architectural plans managed to quarry, transport, shape, and erect 20-ton stone pillars with geometric precision across a hilltop construction site, and then cover the whole thing up when they were done. It requires us to believe that people who, according to the official story, spent most of their waking hours hunting and foraging for food somehow found the time, the energy, the organizational capacity, and the technical knowledge to accomplish something that would challenge a modern construction crew. I will leave you to decide how comfortable you are with that explanation, because Göbekli Tepe is not alone. It is the most dramatic example, but it is far from the only one. In the waters off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, there is an underwater structure of massive stone terraces and platforms and what appear to be carved steps and walls. It sits at a depth that places its construction, if it is indeed constructed and not entirely natural, which remains debated, at a time period that predates the official beginning of Japanese civilization by thousands of years. In the waters off the coast of Cuba, explorers using sonar equipment in the early 2000s detected what appeared to be a grid of stone structures on the ocean floor. Structures arranged with a regularity that suggested deliberate construction, sitting at a depth of 600 meters, which would place their original construction at a time period far beyond anything our official history accounts for. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys revealed what appeared to be the remains of a vast submerged city, with what looked like streets and buildings laid out in organized patterns beneath 30 meters of water. All of these sites share something in common. They are underwater. They were submerged. Whatever was there before, whatever civilization built these structures, whatever people lived in these places, whatever knowledge they had accumulated, was swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, which is, not coincidentally, exactly the time period that virtually every ancient culture in the world associates with the Great Flood. And this brings us to the heart of what this chapter is really about, because the book of Enoch, the Torah, the Vedic scriptures, the Sumerian texts, the myths of Egypt and Greece and Mesoamerica, all of these traditions are not merely telling us that a flood happened. They are telling us that a flood destroyed something specific, something significant, a world that existed before our world, a civilization that rose and flourished and then was washed away so completely that almost nothing of it survived. Almost nothing. Because here's the thing. A few things did survive, not intact, not in the form of museums or libraries or cities that we can walk through and study at our leisure, but in fragments, in ruins, in structures whose age defies our timelines and whose construction methods we cannot fully explain, and in stories, in myths and sacred texts and oral traditions that were passed down from generation to generation by people who understood that they were carrying something precious, something that needed to survive, a memory of a world that no longer existed. Let's talk about what that world looked like. The book of Enoch gives us extraordinary detail about the pre-flood civilization. It describes a world in which the Nephilim and their watcher fathers had effectively positioned themselves as the ruling class over a global, or at least vastly widespread, human population. The knowledge that the watchers had shared had been weaponized, in the most literal sense. Metallurgy had produced weapons of war. Astronomy had been turned to astrological manipulation, the use of celestial knowledge to control and mystify ordinary people who had no framework for understanding it. The agricultural sciences had been used not to ensure that everyone had enough to eat, but to create surpluses that flowed upward to the ruling class, while the people who produced them went without. Sound familiar? In the Vedic tradition, the age just before the Great Reset, the Dvapara Yuga, is described as an era of great material advancement and great moral decay existing simultaneously. The knowledge available was extraordinary. The cities were magnificent. The technology, by the standards of what came before, was breathtaking. But the spiritual and ethical foundation of civilization had eroded to almost nothing. Power had concentrated in the hands of a very small number of beings at the top of the hierarchy. The vast majority of the population lived in service to those beings, with little autonomy and less dignity. The natural world was being consumed at a rate it could not sustain, and the cosmic order, whatever divine arrangement was supposed to govern the relationship between heaven and earth, had been so thoroughly violated that the only possible resolution was a complete and total reset. In the Sumerian tradition, we see the same picture painted in slightly different colors. The great god Enlil, surveying the earth from his heavenly vantage point, is so disturbed by the noise and the chaos and the violence of the world below that he calls a council of the gods and proposes its destruction. The word translated as noise in most English versions of these texts is actually a much richer Sumerian term, one that encompasses not just literal sound, but the idea of disorder, of things being out of their proper relationship, of a world that has lost its fundamental harmony. Enlil is not bothered by a loud party. He is disturbed by the existential wrongness of what the world has become. And in the Egyptian tradition, one of the most sophisticated and complex of all the ancient knowledge systems, we find the concept of Ma'at. Ma'at is usually translated as truth or justice, but those translations are too simple. Ma'at is cosmic order. It is the proper alignment of all things, the right relationship between humans and nature, between the earthly and the divine, between action and consequence, between what is taken and what is given back. When Ma'at is maintained, the Nile floods at the right time, and the crops grow, and the people prosper. When Ma'at is violated, when the cosmic order is disrupted, chaos enters the world, and chaos in the Egyptian understanding is not just disorder. It is existential threat. It is the unmaking of reality itself. The pre-flood world, in all of these traditions, had violated Ma'at so thoroughly that chaos was no longer an occasional visitor. It had moved in permanently. Now, let's talk about what the people at the bottom of the civilization experienced, because that is something the ancient texts are sometimes less specific about, and it deserves our attention. Think about what it meant to be an ordinary human being in the world of Nephilim. You are, by comparison, small, physically, intellectually, technologically. You exist in a different category from the beings who rule you. They are taller than you by a meter or more. They live longer than you. They understand things that to you are incomprehensible mysteries. They have weapons you cannot match. They have organizational structures you are excluded from. And this is the part that I think is most important, they have the authority of the divine behind them, because they are literally the children of divine beings, which means that the social hierarchy they represent is not just a political arrangement. It is a cosmic one. To resist them is not just dangerous. It is, in the worldview of the time, a kind of sacrilege. So you work, you farm, you build, you mine, you craft, you fight in their wars when they need bodies to fill their armies. You hand over the fruits of your labor because you have no framework for imagining any other arrangement. And when you tell stories around your fires at night, stories about the great ones, about the giants, about the beings who descended from the sky in the beginning of time, those stories are full of awe and terror in equal measure, because that is what your life is. Awe and terror, wonder and oppression, living in the shadow of magnificent, terrible, insatiable beings who consume everything and are never satisfied. And yet, and this is the detail that makes the story truly heartbreaking, you are also, in your small and limited way, thriving, because the knowledge that the Watchers brought, even filtered down through layers of hierarchy and exploitation, has made human life materially better in certain ways than it was before. There is more food, there is medicine, there is art, there is architecture. There are cities where before there were only scattered camps. The world is larger and more complex and more beautiful than it was. The problem is that none of this beauty belongs to you. You can see it. You can touch it. You help build it. But it is not yours. You are, in the most precise sense, a laborer in someone else's paradise. Now, let's talk about the knowledge itself. Because one of the most extraordinary claims embedded in these ancient texts, and one that is increasingly finding support in unexpected corners of modern science, is that the pre-flood civilization possessed knowledge that we have not yet fully recovered. The Book of Enoch's descriptions of what the Watchers taught are strikingly specific, and when you read them carefully, you notice something. Some of the knowledge described, the astronomical knowledge, for instance, is knowledge that our civilization only rediscovered relatively recently. The Watchers, according to Enoch, taught humans the movements of the stars and planets with precision that implies a heliocentric understanding of the solar system, the understanding that the Earth moves around the sun, not the other way around. This understanding was not officially accepted in Western science until Copernicus in the 16th century, yet the ancient Vedic texts describe it clearly. The ancient Sumerian astronomical records display a knowledge of the movements of celestial bodies that should not have been possible without advanced observational equipment. And certain ancient monuments, Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids of Giza, Stonehenge, the ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, are aligned to astronomical phenomena with a precision that implies a level of observational sophistication that the official timeline of human knowledge cannot account for. Something was known. Something was lost, and we are still, thousands of years later, trying to piece it back together. The Vedic texts go even further. They describe the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, as a time when humans had access to what they call vimanas, flying craft, vehicles that move through the air and through space. Now, most mainstream scholars dismiss this as pure mythology, but I want you to notice something. The descriptions of vimanas in the ancient Sanskrit texts are extraordinarily specific. They are not described the way magical objects are typically described in mythology, vaguely, symbolically, in language that resists literal interpretation. They are described with a kind of specificity that suggests the writers were attempting to describe something real that they had either seen or heard reliable accounts of. Different types, different sizes, different fuel sources, different capabilities. The level of technical detail is remarkable. Are we supposed to believe that the ancient Indians invented the concept of aerospace engineering purely from their imaginations? Or is it possible, even slightly possible, that they were remembering something? In the Mahabharata, one of the two great Sanskrit epics, a text so long that it contains more words than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. There are descriptions of battles that sound, with uncomfortable familiarity, like descriptions of modern warfare. Weapons that release light and heat with the force of 1,000 suns. Weapons that, when deployed, cause the hair and nails of survivors to fall out. Weapons that contaminate the water and the land for years afterward. Survivors washing themselves in rivers to try to cleanse themselves of an invisible contamination. Food being avoided because it had been somehow poisoned by the weapons used. These descriptions, if you did not know they came from a text thousands of years old, could be describing nuclear warfare. The specific details, the light brighter than the sun, the hair loss, the contamination of water and food, the survivors desperately bathing to remove something invisible from their skin. These are not generic descriptions of violence. They are strikingly specific, and they match, in disturbing detail, the effects of radiation exposure following a nuclear detonation. I am not telling you that the pre-flood civilization had nuclear weapons. I am telling you that these descriptions exist, that they are specific, and that they deserve more serious attention than they have historically received. In 1945, when Robert Oppenheimer witnessed the first successful test of an atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert, he famously quoted from the Bhagavad Gita. He said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This is one of the most quoted moments in the history of modern science. But what is less often mentioned is that when a journalist later asked Oppenheimer whether this was the first time a nuclear device had ever been detonated, his answer was not the simple yes you might expect. He paused, and then he said, "In modern times." Yes, in modern times. Sit with that. Now let us bring all of this together into a picture of a world that existed before the flood, that reached extraordinary heights of knowledge and power and complexity, and that ultimately destroyed itself through the accumulation of unchecked power, uncontrolled greed, systematic exploitation of both human and natural resources, and a complete severing of its connection to whatever moral or spiritual framework had originally governed its development. This world was not small. It was not primitive. It was not limited to one region or one continent. The myths that describe it come from every corner of the globe, from the Americas to Asia, from Africa to Europe, from the islands of Pacific to the frozen North. Every human culture that is a flood myth, and virtually every human culture does have one, also has a description of the world that existed before the flood. And in culture after culture, that world is described in strikingly similar terms. Greater beings, advanced knowledge, magnificent cities, and a catastrophic moral and spiritual collapse that made the flood not just inevitable but necessary. The world before the flood was a warning, and we stopped listening to it. Let your breath slow now. Let the weight of that lost world settle around you. Picture those cities, the towers and the temples and the great stone monuments. Picture the giants walking through their streets, their heads above the rooftops. Picture the ordinary humans going about their days in the shadows of beings they barely understood. Picture the knowledge flowing upward and the suffering flowing downward. Picture a sky that was beginning very slowly to change. A storm was gathering, not a metaphorical storm, not a spiritual one, a real storm, the likes of which no living creature had ever seen, and no living creature, after it was done, would ever see again. The world before the flood had reached its final chapter, and the rain was about to begin. Listen, do you hear that? In the stillness of wherever you are right now, in the quiet dark of your room, I want you to listen to the silence and imagine it being replaced. Slowly at first, a low rumble, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. A change in the air, a heaviness, a pressure, something electric and ancient and deeply wrong. The animals going quiet, the birds disappearing from the sky, the rivers running strangely, their currents shifting in ways that make the fishermen pull their nets and go home without speaking. A smell in the air that no one has a word for, because no living human has ever smelled it before. The smell of what is coming. And then the first drop falls. Just one. And then another. And then the sky opens. The Great Flood is the single most universally attested event in the entire catalog of human mythology and religious tradition. Let me say that again, because I want the weight of it to land properly. Of all the stories that human beings tell, across all cultures, across all continents, across all time periods, The story of a catastrophic flood that nearly wiped out all life on Earth is the one that appears most consistently, most universally, and most persistently. Researchers have cataloged more than 200 distinct flood myths from cultures around the world. 200, from the Sumerians to the Greeks, from the Hindus to the Mayans, from the indigenous peoples of Australia to the tribes of sub-Saharan Africa, from the Norse to the Chinese, from the Mesopotamians to the Native Americans. 200 separate cultures with no known contact with each other, all telling essentially the same story. A world that had become corrupt and violent and beyond saving. A divine decision to end it. A chosen survivor. One person, one family. Sometimes a small group, warned in advance and given instructions to build a vessel. A flood of incomprehensible scale. The destruction of almost everything. And then, eventually, the waters receding, the survivor emerging, and a new world beginning from almost nothing. This is not coincidence. This is memory. Humanity, scattered to the four corners of the earth by whatever forces dispersed us after catastrophe, carried this memory with it. It became the central story, the foundational myth, the thing that was too important, too traumatic, too world-defining to ever be forgotten, even as the specific names and details shifted and adapted to the languages and cultures of the people retelling it. The event itself, the overwhelming, civilization-ending, world-reshaping event, that remained constant because it happened, because it was real, because the people who survived it and their children children's children could never escape the shadow it cast across everything that came after. But before we follow the waters, before we trace the path of destruction, and survival and aftermath, I want to spend some time with something that most retellings of the flood story rush past. I want to spend some time with a decision, because someone decided to do this, or something. Call it God, call it the Divine Council, call the Anunnaki elders in their great assembly, call it the cosmic forces of cause and effect finally reaching their inevitable conclusion. Whatever framework makes sense to you. But in virtually every flood tradition, the catastrophe is not random. It is not an accident. It is not a natural disaster in the way we use that phrase today. Something impersonal and indifferent, a hurricane or an earthquake that doesn't know or care about the people it destroys. In every ancient tradition, the flood is a response. A deliberate response to something that had gone catastrophically wrong. And understanding what that something was is, I think, the most important part of this entire story. We talked in the last chapter about the world before flood, the world of Nephilim, the world of advanced knowledge and advanced exploitation, the world in which the gap between the powerful and the powerless had grown so vast and so entrenched that had become simply the nature of reality, the way things were, the way things had always been, as far as anyone currently living could remember. And we talked about how that world was consuming itself, consuming its people, consuming its resources, consuming the very earth it was built on, with an appetite that never reached satisfaction. But I want to go deeper than that, because the ancient texts, when you read them carefully, are pointing at something more specific than just general wickedness or social injustice, as catastrophic as those things were. They are pointing at a violation of something fundamental. In the Sumerian version of the flood story, which predates the biblical version by at least 1,000 years and shares so many specific details with it, that most serious scholars now acknowledge the biblical account was heavily influenced by the Sumerian one. The god Enlil calls a council and argues for the destruction of humanity. And the reason he gives is not simply that humans are wicked. The reason he gives is that the world has become too noisy. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, this word, noise, carries in the original Sumerian a much broader meaning than simple auditory disturbance. It encompasses the idea of a world that has lost its right ordering, a world that is vibrating at the wrong frequency, a world in which the natural relationships between things, between powerful and powerless, between divine and human, between civilization and nature, have been so thoroughly distorted that the distortion has become self-perpetuating. There is no path back to balance for within the system. The system itself has become the problem, and the only solution is to stop the system entirely. In the Book of Enoch, the decision to send the flood comes after a very specific moment. It comes after the cries of the earth itself reach heaven. This is an image I find extraordinarily powerful and strangely modern. The earth, not the people, not the angels, not the divine beings. The earth itself is described as making complaint, as crying out, as sending up from its wounds and its exhaustion, and its violation a signal that penetrates all the way to the highest levels of whatever cosmic hierarchy governs the universe. The earth says, in whatever language the earth speaks, enough, no more. I cannot sustain what is being done to me any longer. And heaven responds. In the Vedic tradition, the decision to end the age comes from the god Vishnu, who appears in various avatars throughout the course of cosmic history to restore balance when it has been lost. The concept here is dharma, cosmic law, the right ordering of all things, and the flood, in the Vedic understanding, is not punishment in the simple moral sense of wrongdoing being penalized. It is correction. It is the universe's immune system responding to an infection. It is the cosmic order reasserting itself after a period of profound violation. Vishnu does not destroy the world because he is angry. He destroys it because the alternative is a level of corruption so total that nothing good can survive within it. The flood, in all of these traditions, is an act of preservation masquerading as an act of destruction. Now let us follow Noah, or Utnapishtim, as the Sumerians called him, or Manu, as the Vedic texts call him, or Deucalion, as the Greeks called him. The name's change of the story is, at its core, the same. One man or one family is singled out from among all the people of the corrupted world and told what is coming, told to prepare, given specific and detailed instructions about how to build a vessel capable of surviving what no vessel has ever been asked to survive before. In the biblical tradition, the account of Noah and his ark is so familiar that it has perhaps lost some of its strangeness. We grew up with images of cartoon arks filled with cheerful pairs of animals, and the violence and terror of what is being described has been thoroughly domesticated by repetition and familiarity. So, I want to try to strip that away for a moment. I want to try to hear this story as if for the first time, through the ears of someone who has no cartoon images in their head. Someone who is hearing it told around fire on a dark night thousands of years ago, and who receives it as what was always intended to be, a warning and a testimony. A man is told by the creator of the universe that everything he knows is about to be destroyed. Not damaged, not disrupted, destroyed. Every living thing on the surface of the earth. Every person he has ever met who is not in his immediate family. Every city he has ever seen. Every field and forest and river valley. The entire world he has lived in for all of his life is going to cease to exist. And he is told to build a box, a very large box, and fill it with animals 2 by 2, and put his family inside it and to wait. And he does. He builds the ark. In the biblical account, the dimensions given are extraordinary. Roughly 137 meters long, 23 meters wide, 14 meters tall. This is not a rowboat. This is a structure the size of a modern ocean-going vessel, built from wood, built by hand, built by one family following instructions from a divine source, in the middle of a landlocked region, while their neighbors watched and presumably mocked and definitely did not help. The Sumerian version, the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes Utnapishtim's vessel as a perfect cube, each side 60 meters long, with 7 decks. Different details, same basic reality. An enormous, purpose-built vessel, constructed in advance of catastrophe that its builder understood was coming even if no one around him could believe it. And then the rains began. The biblical account says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But the flood itself, the inundation, lasted much longer. The waters rose and rose and rose until even the highest mountains were covered. Think about what that means for a moment. Not hills, not valleys, mountains, the highest points on the surface of the earth, submerged beneath water, the entire surface of the planet. Ocean. This is not a regional flooding event. This is not the Nile overflowing its banks or a coastal city being swallowed by a tsunami. This is a planetary catastrophe of a scale that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. And here is where the ancient stories and modern science begin to have a very interesting conversation. Because geologists and oceanographers and climate scientists have known for decades that something very dramatic happened to the Earth's oceans and coastlines at the end of the last ice age, approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago. As the massive ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere during the last glacial maximum began to melt, the sea levels rose, not gently, not gradually, in the way that modern climate change discussions tend to frame sea level rise. Rapidly, in geological terms, almost instantaneously. Researchers have found evidence of periods during this deglaciation process when sea levels rose by meters per century, fast enough that a person living through it would have been able to observe the change within their own lifetime. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. Think about what that means in terms of geography. Vast continental shelves that are now underwater were then dry land. The British Isles were connected to continental Europe by a land bridge. Southeast Asia was a single large landmass rather than the archipelago of islands it is today. The Bering Strait between Asia and North America was dry land. The famous Bering Land Bridge that humans used to first populate the Americas. The Persian Gulf was dry. The North Sea was dry. The coastlines of every continent on Earth were tens of kilometers further out than they are today. And then the ice melted, and the sea came in. Not all at once. The process took thousands of years in total. But within that long process, there appear to have been episodes of sudden, catastrophic acceleration. Events where a massive ice dam gave way or a huge ice sheet destabilized all at once, releasing enormous quantities of fresh water into the ocean in a geological instant. One of the most dramatic of these events is what researchers call meltwater pulse 1A, a period approximately 14,000 years ago, during which sea levels may have risen by as much as 20 meters in just a few centuries. Possibly faster. 20 meters in a few centuries. Entire coastlines vanishing. Entire regions of habitable land swallowed by the advancing sea. Communities that had lived in the same place for generations suddenly finding the water at their doorstep, then at their windows, then above their rooftops. If you were living through that, if you were a person in one of those coastal communities watching the water come, you would not describe it as a gradual geological process. You would describe it as a flood. The biggest flood you had ever seen or heard of. A flood that ended the world you knew. And you would tell your children about it. And they would tell their children. And the story would be carried forward, generation by generation, accumulating the weight of memory and the distortions of retelling, until it arrived in the form we now know it as the Great Flood, as Noah, as Utnapishtim, as Manu, as Deucalion, as the 200 separate flood myths that researchers have cataloged from cultures around the world. All of them remember the same water. But the physical flooding, as catastrophic as it was, may not even be the most significant part of what happened, because the ancient texts are describing something that goes beyond rising sea levels. They are describing a transformation of the entire Earth system, a change not just in the waters but in the skies and the climate, in the very conditions that make life on the surface of the planet possible. The Book of Enoch describes a flood as involving not just rain but the opening of the windows of heaven, a phrase that suggests something more than precipitation. Some researchers have interpreted this as a description of a comet or asteroid impact, or a series of them, an event that would have sent enormous quantities of water and debris into the atmosphere, while simultaneously triggering massive tsunamis and destabilizing ice sheets. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a scientific theory that has gained increasing support in recent years, proposes that approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth was struck by fragments of a comet or asteroid, triggering a rapid global cooling event, massive wildfires across North America, and a sudden drop in sea levels followed by catastrophic flooding as the climate destabilized. The evidence of this hypothesis includes a layer of microscopic diamonds, shock quartz, and platinum, materials associated with cosmic impacts, found in geological deposits dating to exactly this period, across multiple continents. In other words, something fell from the sky, and the world was never the same again. Inside the ark, inside whatever vessels these ancient survivors used, whatever real or metaphorical protection, they had prepared against what was coming. Noah and his family waited, day after day, week after week. The sound of water everywhere, the darkness, the movement, the not knowing, the grief of knowing that everything outside their wooden walls was gone. the people they had known, the places they had loved, the world they had been born into, gone. The book of Genesis says that God remembered Noah, and the waters receded. The ark came to rest on a mountain. The biblical account says Ararat, which corresponds to the mountain range in what is now eastern Turkey. And Noah sent out birds, first a raven, then a dove, to test whether the land was dry enough to return to. And the dove came back with an olive branch, the first green thing in a drowned world. And Noah stepped out of the ark, onto a planet that had been reset. Think about what that moment must have felt like. You have been inside a wooden vessel, in the dark and the noise and the uncertainty, for weeks or months. And now you open the door and you step out into the light. And there is silence, a silence more complete than any silence you have ever heard, because the world that used to fill that silence with its noise, the cities, the voices, the animals, the commerce, the violence, all of it is gone. There's only the sun and the mud and the distant mountains and the smell of earth that has been underwater for longer than you want to think about. You are, as far as you know, the only human being alive, you and your family, starting over. The Sumerian version of this story adds a detail that I find particularly haunting. When Utnapishtim finally steps out of his vessel after the flood, he offers a sacrifice, burns offerings on a mountaintop, and the gods who have been waiting for the flood to end smell the smoke and gather around it like flies. The comparison is deliberate and striking. These divine beings who order the destruction of the entire world are described, in the moment of its aftermath, as hungry and desperate, crowding around the first fire they have seen since the waters came. Because in destroying the world, they also destroyed the people who fed them, who made the offerings and burned the sacrifices that sustained the divine realm. They needed humanity to survive, even as they had decided that humanity needed to be destroyed. The gods and humans, it turns out, needed each other. And so the covenant was made. In the biblical version, God sets a rainbow in the sky as a sign, a promise that the earth will never again be destroyed by flood. In the Sumerian version, the mother goddess Ninhursag weeps and holds up her lapis lazuli necklace as a memorial to humans who died. In both traditions, there is a recognition that what just happened cannot happen again, that the price was too high, that a different way forward must be found. The world had been emptied, and now it had to be refilled. But here is a question that the ancient texts raise and then, frustratingly, only partially answer. The question that lies at the heart of everything we are going to explore in the remaining chapters of tonight's story. Was the reset complete? The flood was sent to destroy the Nephilim, to end the reign of the giants, to wash away the corruption and the violence and the exploitation and the wrong that had accumulated over generations of unchecked power. That was the purpose. That was the plan. But what if the plan did not fully succeed? What if some of them survived? The rain has stopped now. The waters are receding. The mud is dry in the first sunlight to touch the earth in what feels like forever. And somewhere in a cave on a mountain or in a hold of a ship or in a valley high enough to have stayed above the waterline, something very large is stirring. Something that was supposed to be gone. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the quiet settling around you like the settling of floodwaters finding their final level. Feel the weight of that emptied world, the grief of it, the strange, terrible beauty of a planet washed clean. But do not sleep too deeply yet, because the story is not over. The giants are not all gone. And in the next chapter, we are going to find them. Breathe slowly. Let the image of that flooded world settle around you. The silence, the mud, the receding waters, the first pale sunlight breaking through clouds that have not parted in weeks. Hold that image, because I want you to step into it with me now. I want you to walk through that newly emptied world and ask the question that the religious texts raise, and then carefully, almost deliberately, avoid answering directly. What if not all of them died? It seems like a simple question, almost too simple. But follow for a moment, because the implications are enormous. The flood was sent, according to every major tradition that describes it, specifically to end the reign of the Nephilim, to cleanse the earth of the corruption they had introduced, to wipe the slate clean so that humanity could begin again without the crushing weight of divine human hybrids sitting at the top of every hierarchy, consuming everything, answering to no one. That was the purpose. That was a divine intent. as described in the book of Enoch, in the Torah, in the Sumerian tablets, in the Vedic scriptures. But intent and outcome are not always the same thing. And the ancient texts themselves, the very texts that describe the flood as a cleansing, as a reset, as the end of the giant age, also contain within them, sometimes in the very next chapter, sometimes in passages that sit just a few verses away from the descriptions of total destruction, references to giants. Giants who are very much alive. Giants who are living in specific places, ruling specific regions, interacting with specific human populations, long after the waters were supposed to have ended their story. This is not a minor inconsistency. This is a crack in the official narrative that runs all the way from the ancient world to the present day. And when you pull on that crack, when you follow to see where it leads, you end up somewhere deeply strange and deeply fascinating, and ultimately, somewhere that involves the United States government and a museum in Washington, D.C., and a warehouse full of bones that nobody is allowed to see. But we will get there. First, let's follow the trail in the ancient texts. In the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Torah, the account of the Israelites wandering through the wilderness after their exodus from Egypt, Moses receives a divine command to send spies into the land of Canaan, the land that God has promised to give to the Israelites, the land flowing with milk and honey. Moses selects 12 men, one from each of the 12 tribes, all of them leaders, all of them capable and experienced and chosen specifically for this mission. And he sends them north into Canaan to scout the land, to assess its geography, its resources, its defenses, and its people. The spies are gone for 40 days. When they return, they bring back physical evidence of the land's extraordinary fertility, a single cluster of grapes so large that it takes 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. The land is everything God promised, rich and abundant and beautiful, but their faces are pale, their voices are shaking, and what they report to Moses and to the assembled community of Israel is not a triumphant declaration of readiness. It is something closer to terror. They went about among the people. They saw the cities. They assessed the defenses. They looked at the inhabitants of Canaan. And then they came back and told the Israelites what they had seen. All the people we saw were of great height. We saw they're the children of Anak, who are the Nephilim race. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. And so we were in their sight. Stop there for a moment. The children of Anak, the Nephilim race. This is not a throwaway line. This is not a vague mythological reference. This is a specific named group of people living in a specific geographical location, identified by name as belonging to the lineage of Nephilim, the giants who were supposed to have been destroyed by the flood. And it is being described not in some ancient mythological context, but in what the Torah presents as a historical account, a military reconnaissance report, the kind of report that one sends back to a commanding officer about the actual conditions encountered in the field. The Anakim were real, and they were still there. Let's think about what this means. If the Nephilim race survived the flood, even a remnant of it, even a scattered handful of lineages that managed somehow to persist through catastrophe, then everything changes. The flood did not accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish. The reset was incomplete. The corruption that the flood was sent to end did not end. It went underground. It survived in pockets. It persisted in the highlands and the remote regions and the defensible mountain strongholds where the waters, perhaps, did not reach, or where certain individuals were cunning enough or powerful enough or simply lucky enough to find a way through. And if they survived the flood, then the question becomes not just historical but deeply personal. What happened to them after? The Torah gives us part of the answer. It tells us that the Israelites, initially paralyzed by the terrifying report of spies, initially unwilling to enter Canaan because of the giants who lived there, eventually, after decades of wandering and gradual spiritual strengthening, did enter the land. And they fought the Anakim, tribe by tribe, city by city, valley by valley. The book of Joshua describes these campaigns in remarkable military detail. The specific cities taken, the specific kings defeated, the specific regions cleared. And in these accounts, the giants are not an abstraction. They are named. Their cities are named. Their kings are named. There was Ahiman and Sheshai and Talmai, the children of Anak, living in the city of Hebron. There was Og, king of Bashan, described in the book of Deuteronomy as the last of the Rephaim, another name used in the Torah for the giant lineages. His bed, the text tells us, was made of iron and was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. 9 cubits. Depending on which ancient cubit measurement you use, that is somewhere between 4 and 5 meters. A bed 4 to 5 meters long for a man who presumably needed it. The Torah was not known for including mundane furniture dimensions without reason. Someone measured that bed. Someone thought the measurement was important enough to record. And then there's the most famous giant encounter of all, the one that has become so embedded in the cultural consciousness of the Western world that it has become a metaphor for any contest between the small and the powerful. The story of David and Goliath. But I want to tell you this story the way it was originally told, not the sanitized, children's Sunday school version with the slingshot and the moral about courage. I want to tell you the military and historical context that surround it, because that context makes it far more interesting and far more strange. The Philistines were a people living along the coastal regions of Canaan, what is now the Gaza Strip and southern Israel. They were, by the standards of the ancient Near East, technologically advanced. They had iron weapons at a time when the Israelites were still largely using bronze. They were organized militarily in a sophisticated way, and they had, within their ranks, individuals who belonged to the giant lineages. The text describes them specifically, warriors of extraordinary size and strength, members of what appears to have been a hereditary warrior caste within Philistine society, not random large individuals, but a recognized and cultivated military asset. Giants bred and trained for war. Goliath was one of these. The text of 1 Samuel describes him in detail that is almost clinical in its precision. His height is given as 6 cubits and a span, approximately 3 meters by most calculations, though some ancient manuscripts give slightly different numbers. His armor is described piece by piece. A bronze helmet, a coat of scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze, which is roughly 57 kilograms of armor on his body alone, not counting his weapons. His spear shaft is described as being like a weaver's beam, the large wooden rod used in a loom, and the iron-pointed spear weighed 600 shekels, approximately 7 kilograms. He carried a shield so large that he had a dedicated shield bearer walking in front of him. This is not a description of a large man. This is a description of a walking weapon system. And for 40 days, this walking weapon system walked out every morning and every evening to the front line between the Philistine and Israelite armies. And he issued his challenge. Send someone to fight me, one-on-one. The winner's side wins the war. Every morning for 40 days. And every morning for 40 days, the Israelite army looked at him and no one moved. Because no one in the Israelite army was equipped, physically, psychologically, or perhaps spiritually, to face what Goliath represented. And then a shepherd boy showed up to deliver food to his brothers. David was not a soldier. He was the youngest son of a man named Jesse, sent from his home in Bethlehem to the front lines with bread and cheese for his older brothers who were serving in the army. He was young. He was small. He had no armor and no military training. What he had was a sling, the ancient equivalent of a shepherd's tool, used to drive off wolves and predators from a flock, and an absolute unshakable certainty that the giant standing in that valley was not, ultimately, more powerful than the God he served. The conversation between David and Saul, the king of Israel, before the battle is one of the most psychologically fascinating passages in the entire Torah. Saul tries to give David his own armor, his own sword, his own helmet, and David puts them on and takes a few steps and then takes them all off again and sets them aside. Because he is not built for this kind of fight. The armor doesn't fit. The sword is not his weapon. He knows, with a clarity that only the very young or the very certain ever possess, that he has to fight this battle his way. Not the way the army fights. Not the way Goliath expects. His way. He picks up 5 smooth stones from the brook. 5. Not 1. 5. Think about that detail for a moment, because the text tells us that Goliath had 4 brothers, 4 other giant warriors in the Philistine ranks. David picked up 1 stone for Goliath and 4 stones for his brothers. He was not just planning to win this fight. He was planning to win all the fights that might follow it. He walked down into the valley to meet Goliath, and Goliath looked at him and was insulted. He was furious, the indignity of it, that the Israelites had sent a boy to face him, a boy with a stick and a bag. He said, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And he cursed David by his gods and told him to come closer, so that he could give his flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David ran toward him, not walked, ran toward the enormous armored giant with nothing but a sling and a stone and whatever it is that lives inside a person who is completely unafraid of the thing that everyone else is afraid of. He ran, and he reached into his bag, and he loaded the sling, and he let fly. The stone hit Goliath in the forehead, the one place on his heavily armored body that was not protected. The impact was enough. Goliath fell, and David ran to him and drew Goliath's own sword from its sheath and cut off his head with it. A boy who had come to the battlefield to deliver cheese ended the 40-day standoff with a rock and 3 seconds of perfect aim. But here is what I want you to notice about this story. The battle of David and Goliath is not presented in the Torah as a miraculous exception, as the one time in recorded history that a human encountered a giant. It is presented as one encounter in a long ongoing series of encounters. The text goes on to describe other battles, other giants. Ishbi-Benob, who wielded a bronze spear and whose spear weighed 300 shekels. Saph, another descendant of the giants. A man described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total. A specific physical description that suggests the writer was recording an actual observation rather than creating a mythological embellishment. All of them descendants of the Rephaim. All of them killed, eventually, by David and his warriors. David and his warriors. The Israelites were hunting giants, systematically, deliberately, valley by valley and city by city, and warrior by warrior. And they were not the only ones. Across the ocean, in a world that the ancient Middle East had no official knowledge of, the same story was playing out, in different landscapes, with different names, in different languages, but the same essential drama. Giants living among humans. Giants threatening and consuming and dominating the people around them. And humans, sometimes divided, sometimes united only by the shared threat, fighting back. Let us go to Nevada. The Paiute people have lived in the desert and mountain regions of what is now Nevada for thousands of years. They are a people with a deep and detailed oral tradition, a tradition that, like all genuine oral traditions, preserves real historical information within its stories, even when those stories are carried in the form of legend and myth. And the Paiute oral tradition contains an account of a people they called the Sitesage, or, in some tellings, the Saiduka. The Sitesage were not Paiute. They were not any of the native peoples of the region. They were something else entirely, something that came from outside, from the sea, in large canoes. According to the tradition, they were tall, very tall, and they had red hair. Red hair. This detail appears again and again in accounts of giant encounters from around the world, and I want you to hold on to it, because we're going to come back to it. In the context of the Native American traditions of the American West, red hair was not a common genetic trait. It was extraordinary, remarkable enough to be remembered and recorded as a defining characteristic of the strange and threatening people who arrived from the sea. The Sitesage, according to the Paiute tradition, were cannibals. They hunted and ate the people they encountered, and they were powerful enough that no single tribe could resist them. The Paiute and the neighboring tribes who shared the region with them were not unified people. They had their own conflicts, their own territorial disputes, their own reasons to distrust each other. But the Sitesage were a threat so overwhelming that it overrode every existing division. Every tribe in the region set aside their conflicts and formed an alliance for the sole purpose of destroying the Sitesage. This alliance hunted the Sitesage across the landscape of Nevada, fought them, drove them back, and finally, in one last great battle, drove the remaining Sitesage into a cave. A large cave in a limestone cliff in what is now Humboldt County, Nevada. The allied tribes piled brush and wood at the entrance of the cave. They shot fire arrows into it. They stacked stones across the mouth to seal it, and they burned the Sitesage alive inside. This is the story as it was told by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, the daughter of a Paiute chief, one of the first Native American women to write a book in English, published in 1882. She insisted, with a firmness that impressed and somewhat unsettled her readers, that this was not mythology. This was not a story in the way that creation myths are stories. This was history. This was something that had actually happened. Something that her people remembered not as legend, but as fact. The way you remember the name of a war or the founding of a city. And then the archaeologists arrived. In 1912, the Lovelock Cave, the cave that matches a description in the Paiute oral tradition, located in Humboldt County, Nevada, approximately 150 kilometers northeast of Reno, was excavated for the first time by the University of California. Over the course of excavations that continued until 1924, the cave gave up an extraordinary quantity of material, thousands of artifacts, organic materials preserved by the dry desert air with remarkable fidelity, duck decoys made of tule reeds, the oldest known decoys ever found in North America, so well preserved that the feathers were still intact, baskets, tools, bones, and then the strange things. The ash deposits at the entrance of the cave were extensive, evidence of a large and prolonged fire, consistent with the Paiute account of the cave being burned. The deeper passages of the cave contain handprints on the walls, large handprints, larger than the handprints of the native peoples whose artifacts were also found in the cave, and there were the mummies. Several naturally mummified remains were found in the cave, preserved by the exceptional dryness of the Nevada desert. Some of these remains were of normal human size and proportions, but some were not. Reports from the excavation, published in contemporary newspapers and documented in the excavation records, describe mummified remains of individuals of extraordinary stature. The Lovelock Review Minor, a local Nevada newspaper, reported in 1931 that 2 mummified remains had been found near the cave site in the dried bed of a nearby lake. One of them was described as being over 2 meters tall. Both had red hair. Red hair again. The physical evidence found in the cave included oversized sandals, footwear that, by the proportions described, would fit a person significantly taller than any known Native American population of the region. The sandals were woven from plant fiber and were clearly functional footwear, not ceremonial objects. Someone wore them. Someone with feet large enough to need them. Also found in and around the cave were bones, human bones, but bones of unusual size, larger femurs, larger skulls, jaw bones with teeth that were double-rowed in some cases. Another specific physical characteristic that appears in ancient giant descriptions from cultures around the world with consistency that is difficult to dismiss. In the Torah, the giant warrior described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot is part of a broader catalog of physical anomalies associated with the Nephilim lineages. Double rows of teeth is another such anomaly mentioned in various ancient accounts. The Lovelock Cave finds were remarkable. They were reported. They were documented. They were sent to museums, primarily to the Smithsonian Institution and to Nevada State Historical Society. And then, gradually, they became difficult to find. The most unusual remains, the oversized bones, the mummified red-haired individuals, the items whose dimensions implied a human population significantly larger than any known group. These things went into storage, into archives, into the kind of institutional darkness that things disappear into when powerful institutions decide that the implications of those things are too destabilizing to put on public display. This is a pattern we are going to examine in much more detail in our next chapter. But for now, I want to stay with the geographical scope of what was being found, because Lovelock Cave was not an isolated discovery. It was part of a pattern of finds that was spreading across the entire North American continent during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period of intense archaeological activity driven by a combination of westward expansion, railroad construction, and the activities of institutions like the Smithsonian that were actively funding excavations and cataloging the material they found. In Ohio, near the famous Serpent Mound, one of the most remarkable earthworks in the world, a quarter-mile-long effigy of a serpent carved into the landscape of a hilltop, its mouth open around what appears to be an egg, its body undulating across the terrain in a series of curves whose astronomical alignments continue to be studied. Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard University was conducting excavations in the 1880s, and what he found in the burial mound surrounding the Serpent Mound included skeletal remains of individuals who were, by his measurements and accounts, approximately 3 meters tall, with bones twice the density of normal human bones. Putnam was not a sensationalist. He was a serious, methodical, highly respected scientist, the founder of the anthropology departments at both Harvard and the University of California. He did not casually report extraordinary findings. He reported what he found, documented it carefully, and submitted it through the proper institutional channels. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian. In Alabama, in 1892, a Smithsonian-funded excavation of a site called Crump's Cave uncovered a series of large wooden coffins, unusual in their construction, not the simple burial boxes typical of the region's indigenous cultures. These were processed differently, constructed with metal fittings, shaped in ways that the descriptions of the time suggest were designed to accommodate occupants of non-standard dimensions. The discovery was officially cataloged by the Smithsonian, officially recorded, and then they went to Washington. In New York, the New York Times, not a tabloid, not a sensationalist publication, but the newspaper record of the United States, ran articles in the late 1800s describing the discovery of giant skeletal remains in various parts of the country. These articles were not presented as curiosities or entertainment pieces. They were reported in the same straightforward tone as any other news story of the era. Remains found, dimensions recorded, authorities notified. The remains went to the Smithsonian. Across the American Midwest, during the great mound opening period of the late 19th century, when amateur archaeologists and professional researchers alike were systematically excavating the thousands of earthen mounds that the indigenous cultures of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys had constructed over thousands of years, similar reports kept emerging. Oversized remains, double rows of teeth, skulls with unusual cranial features, bones whose dimensions implied individuals far outside the normal range of human variation, all going to the Smithsonian. When you map these discoveries geographically, something striking emerges. They are not random. They cluster in certain regions: the Ohio Valley, the Nevada Basin, the coastal regions of the Southeast, the Pacific Northwest, regions that, when you overlay the mythology and oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of those areas, turn out to be exactly the regions those traditions associate with the presence of giant peoples in the ancient past. The archaeology and the mythology are pointing at the same places. This is not coincidence. This is convergence. And somewhere in the vast storage facilities of the Smithsonian Institution, in crates and drawers and archive boxes that have not been opened in decades, the physical evidence of that convergence is sitting in the dark, waiting. But before we go to the Smithsonian, before we follow that particular thread into the labyrinth of institutional suppression and deliberate historical erasure, I want to go one more place. Because the story of giant survivors after flood is not just an American story, or a Middle Eastern story, or an Indian story. It is a planetary story. And nowhere does it become stranger or more specific, or more difficult to explain away than in the mountains of Kazakhstan. In 2008, in the Altai Mountains region of southern Siberia, a finger bone was found in a cave called Denisova Cave. Just a finger bone. The fragment of a pinky finger from what appeared to be a juvenile individual. It was small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. And yet this tiny fragment of ancient bone would, over the following years, completely rewrite our understanding of human prehistory. When researchers extracted DNA from the Denisova finger bone and sequenced it, they discovered something extraordinary. This was not a Homo sapiens. It was not a Neanderthal, whose DNA we were already familiar with. It was something else entirely, a previously unknown species or subspecies of archaic human, which researchers named Denisovan after the cave where it was found. A human lineage that had lived alongside Homo sapiens and Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years, that had interbred with both, and that had left traces of its DNA in the genomes of modern human populations across Asia and the Pacific. But what was particularly interesting, from the perspective of the story we've been telling tonight, was the physical evidence that emerged as more Denisovan remains were found. The Denisovans were big. Their molar teeth, found in the cave, were significantly larger than Homo sapiens' teeth. So large that if you encountered one without context, you have serious difficulty attributing it to any known human species. Their jaw bones were more robust. Their skeletal remains, insofar as they have been recovered, suggest individuals of greater stature and greater physical mass than modern humans. And their DNA reveals something that makes the mythology suddenly feel very close. The Denisovans interbred with Homo sapiens in multiple populations across multiple time periods. The modern human populations with the highest levels of Denisovan DNA include the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea, Australia, and Melanesia. Populations that live in the exact regions where oral traditions of giant beings are particularly prevalent. Tibetan people carry a specific Denisovan gene variant that allows them to survive at high altitudes where other humans cannot. A literal genetic inheritance from a non-human lineage that changed what was physically possible for those who carried it. The Denisovans are the Nephilim. I am not saying that. What I am saying is that the Denisovans are proof, hard, genetic, peer-reviewed scientific proof, that Homo sapiens shared this planet with at least one other species of larger, physically distinct archaic human for tens of thousands of years, that we interbred with them, that their DNA lives in us, and that when the ancient texts describe the children of divine beings mating with human women and producing giant offspring, they may be describing, in the mythological language of their time, a biological reality that modern science is only now beginning to document. The gap between mythology and genetics is narrowing, and in that narrowing space, the story of the Nephilim survivors, the giants of Canaan, the red-haired CTCH of Nevada, the enormous figures whose bones kept turning up in American burial mounds and whose remains kept disappearing into the vaults of powerful institutions, starts to look less like legend and more like suppressed history. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the darkness of that cave in Nevada. Feel the ash and the silence and the millennia of forgetting that sit between us and whatever actually happened there. Feel the weight of the bones and their institutional darkness. The crates and the drawers and the archive boxes that nobody is allowed to open. The giants were real. Some of them survived the flood. And the people who found their remains did not want you to know. In the next chapter, we are going to find out why. Stay with me, because this is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being something uncomfortably close to the present. This is where the myths and the archaeology and the oral traditions of a dozen civilizations converge on a single institution, a museum on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and where the question stops being did giant exist and becomes something far more disturbing. Who decided you should know about them? Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the story becomes impossible to dismiss. Between the 1890s and the 1940s, across the length and breadth of North America, approximately 1,000 skeletal remains of individuals of extraordinary stature were excavated, documented, reported, and submitted to institutional custody. 1,000. These were not whispered rumors or campfire stories. They were official discoveries, cataloged by professional archaeologists, reported in mainstream newspapers, documented in the records of universities and museums. The New York Times ran the stories. Harvard researchers filed the reports. The Smithsonian Institution funded many of the excavations directly, and today, not one of these remains is on public display anywhere in the United States. Not one. Let that sit for a moment. 1,000 documented discoveries. 0 public exhibits. In any other field of science, the disappearance of 1,000 specimens from the official record would be considered a scandal of extraordinary proportions. In this field, it has been met with something closer to institutional silence. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846 with a mandate that could not sound more straightforward: the increase and diffusion of knowledge. It is funded by the American taxpayer. It holds in trust for the American people and for the world one of the most significant collections of scientific and historical material ever assembled. It is, by any measure, one of the most powerful and most trusted scientific institutions on Earth. And it has a very strange relationship with giant bones. Let's go back to Alabama. To Crump's Cave, 1892. The Smithsonian funds and conducts an excavation. Large wooden coffins are found, unusual in their construction, processed with metal fittings, shaped in ways consistent with occupants of non-standard dimensions. The discovery is officially cataloged. The coffins are shipped to the Smithsonian in Washington, and then they vanish. Not immediately, not dramatically. They vanish in the slow, bureaucratic way that things vanish inside large institutions. Through misfiling, through transfers between storage facilities, through the quiet accumulation of institutional indifference. When researcher Frederick Poe asked the Smithsonian in 1950 to examine the coffins from the Crump's Cave excavation, he received a response that should have set alarm bells ringing in every corner of the scientific community. Yes, we have records indicating the coffins were sent to us. No, we cannot locate them in our current inventory. 58 years. Gone. When researcher David Barron pursued the matter decades later, he managed to get the Smithsonian to confirm not just that the coffins existed, but that they were unusual, processed with metal, non-standard in shape. And when he asked to see them, he was told that the storage facility where they were located had been closed due to dangerous asbestos levels and was undergoing remediation. That remediation took 10 years. 10 years of asbestos cleanup in a government building, during which time no independent researcher was permitted access to the facility or its contents. Now, I want to be careful here, because institutional incompetence is real and should not be automatically upgraded to conspiracy. Museums lose things. Storage facilities are genuinely difficult to manage at scale. Asbestos remediation genuinely does take time. All of these things are true, but they do not explain the pattern, because it is not just the coffins from Alabama. It is the giant femurs from Ohio that Frederick Putnam documented and submitted, and that cannot be located in the Smithsonian's current collection. It is the oversized skulls from the mound excavations of the Mississippi Valley that appear in the excavation reports and not in the display cases. It is the mummified red-haired remains from Nevada that the Lovelock excavation teams documented and that the Smithsonian received, and that have not been seen publicly since. It is 1,000 separate instances of the same pattern, found, documented, submitted, disappeared, that together constitute something far more significant than routine institutional mismanagement. To understand how this pattern became possible, we need to understand the man who shaped the Smithsonian's approach to American archaeology during the crucial period when these discoveries were being made. His name was Cyrus Thomas. Cyrus Thomas joined the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology in the 1880s, at exactly the moment when the great mound opening era of American archaeology was producing its most extraordinary and most anomalous results. He was a capable scientist in many respects, a serious entomologist, a diligent researcher, but he carried with him a set of ideological commitments that would prove enormously consequential for the shape of American historical understanding. Cyrus Thomas believed, with a conviction that he seems never to have seriously questioned, that the indigenous peoples of North America were primitive, barbaric in the language of his time, fundamentally incapable of the kind of organized, sophisticated, monumental construction that the earthworks and burial mounds of the American Midwest clearly represented. And because he could not reconcile the evidence of sophisticated ancient construction with his belief in Native American primitivism, he developed an alternative explanation that became, under his influence at the Smithsonian, the official position of American archaeology. The mounds, Thomas argued, were not built by the ancestors of the current indigenous populations. They were built by a lost race, a now-vanished civilization that had preceded the native peoples and had been somehow displaced or destroyed before European contact. This lost mound builder theory conveniently explained away both the sophistication of the earthworks and the anomalous remains being found within them, while simultaneously denying any credit for that sophistication to the indigenous peoples themselves. And then Thomas did something even more consequential. He used his institutional power to suppress the competing hypothesis, the one put forward by the genuinely brilliant geologist and ethnologist John Wesley Powell, who had spent years living with and studying Native American cultures and who argued, based on that direct experience, that ancient American civilizations had sophisticated cultural and potentially physical connections with other civilizations around the world, that the common symbolism, the common architectural patterns, the common mythological structures found across ancient cultures on multiple continents were not coincidence, but evidence of genuine contact and exchange. Powell's hypothesis, if taken seriously, if pursued with the institutional resources of the Smithsonian behind it, would have led researchers directly toward the anomalous remains, toward the oversized bones and the double rows of teeth and the red-haired mummies, toward a picture of ancient American history that did not fit the narrative of isolated, primitive cultures developing independently from the rest of the world. Thomas killed that line of inquiry, not through argument. He could not defeat it on the merits, through institutional power. through his control of funding and publication and the direction of official research. He shaped what questions were asked and which findings were highlighted and which were quietly filed away. And the narrative he installed: isolated development, no cross-cultural contact, progressive civilization from simple to complex, became the foundation of mainstream American archaeology. The foundation that cracked every time an anomalous discovery was made, and that was quietly repaired every time, with the broken pieces put back in the archive where no one could see them. In 1990, the United States Congress passed the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, a law designed to correct one of the genuine injustices of American archaeology: the excavation and retention of Native American remains without the consent of or benefit to communities those remains came from. Under NAGPRA, institutions holding Native American skeletal remains were required to inventory those remains and, under specified conditions, return them to the relevant communities. It was a meaningful and important piece of legislation, and buried within it was a specific exemption. The Smithsonian Institution was explicitly excluded from NAGPRA's repatriation requirements, not subject to the same rules as every other institution in the country, not required to inventory its collections in the same way, not required to repatriate under the same conditions, protected by law from the scrutiny that the act imposed on every other museum and university in America. Someone in Washington in 1990 decided that the Smithsonian needed to be protected from the transparency that NAGPRA demanded. Ask yourself why. In 2014, the Smithsonian released an official statement addressing the growing public attention to claims about giant skeletal remains in its collection. The statement was unambiguous. The claims were false, the institution said. The remains described in historical accounts did not belong to humans of extraordinary stature. The coffins described in historical excavation reports did not exist in the collection. The oversized bones reported by 19th century researchers were misidentified, exaggerated, or fabricated. All of it, every anomalous discovery, every newspaper report, every researcher's field notes, fabricated or mistaken. 1,000 documented discoveries, all of them wrong. This is a position of the most powerful scientific institution in the United States. And I want you to notice something about that position. It does not say we have examined these remains and found them to be within normal human parameters. It says they do not exist. It says the people who reported them were lying or mistaken. It says the newspaper articles were false. It says the field notes were inaccurate. It says the bones at dozens. A professional researchers documented over a period of 50 years simply were not there. That is not a scientific conclusion. That is an institutional denial. There is a difference. The truth of what sits in the Smithsonian storage facilities, the truth of what was found in those mounds and caves and lake beds and burial sites across a continent, may never be fully known. Not because it cannot be known, but because the institution entrusted with knowing has spent more than a century deciding what the rest of us are ready to understand. But here is what I believe, after following the story as far as it can be followed through the documents and the testimonies and the mythological traditions that have survived. The bones are there. They are in the dark. And someone decided a very long time ago that they should stay there. Let your breathing slow. Let the image of those storage rooms settle around you. The rows of shelves, the crates stacked in the darkness, the century of institutional silence pressing down on whatever lies inside them. The giants were real. The evidence was found, and the evidence was hidden. But evidence of that kind has a way of refusing to stay hidden forever. In the next chapter, we are going to go around the world, because the Smithsonian can control what happens in its warehouses. It cannot control what the entire rest of the planet remembers. We have spent a long time in America, in caves and museums and archive rooms in the quiet institutional darkness where inconvenient evidence goes to be forgotten. But I want to take you somewhere else now. I want to take you on a slower, quieter journey around the world through the memories of cultures that never spoke to each other, never traded with each other, never shared a written language or a common mythology. And yet all of them, without exception, remember the same thing: the giants. Let's begin in India. Because India has perhaps the oldest and most sophisticated continuous intellectual tradition on Earth, a tradition of philosophical and cosmological thought that stretches back further than almost any other surviving body of knowledge, and that contains within it descriptions of the ancient world that are specific enough and strange enough to demand serious attention. The Vedic tradition divides cosmic time into 4 great ages. The Yugas. The Satya Yuga, the age of truth, is the first and the greatest. It is described as an era of extraordinary advancement, spiritual, technological, intellectual. Humans in the Satya Yuga lived for thousands of years. They were physically larger than we are today. They lived alongside divine beings and their offspring without fear, because the relationship between the human and the divine was not yet broken. Knowledge flowed freely. The earth was abundant. The cosmic order, Dharma, was intact. And humans share this world with beings of immense stature, giants in the most literal sense, beings who appear throughout the Sanskrit epics as kings and warriors and sages, larger than ordinary humans, longer-lived, possessed of knowledge and power that place them in a category between the human and the divine. The Mahabharata describes the Rakshasas, a race of powerful, often enormous beings who lived alongside humans, and whose relationship with humanity ranged from protective to predatory, depending on their individual nature and moral development. Some Rakshasas are described as allies and guardians, others as terrifying hunters who preyed on human communities. The same ambiguity we have encountered in every tradition. Giants are not simply good or evil. They are powerful, and power without wisdom becomes predatory, just as power with wisdom can be protective. The Ramayana gives us the demon king Ravana, a figure of extraordinary intellectual and physical power, a scholar and a musician, and a warrior of godlike capability, who is also a tyrant and an abductor, and ultimately the agent of his own destruction. Ravana is not a mindless monster. He is a being of immense gifts who chose to use those gifts in the service of his own ego rather than in the service of Dharma. And his story ends the way all such stories end, in catastrophic defeat and the restoration of cosmic order. In Tibet, the memory of giants takes a different form but carries the same essential weight. The ancient Bon tradition, the pre-Buddhist spiritual tradition in Tibet, whose roots reach back into a prehistory that mainstream scholarship has barely begun to map, describes enormous beings who guard the sacred places of the Himalayan landscape, not mythological guardians in the abstract sense. Specific beings, associated with specific mountains and specific cave systems, described with physical specificity that suggests the tradition is preserving memories of actual encounters. Tibetan monks, when pressed on this subject, do not speak of these beings in the past tense. They speak of them as still present, still occupying certain remote valleys and high cave systems in the Himalayas where ordinary humans do not go. Whether this is literal belief or symbolic expression of something more spiritual is difficult to determine from the outside, but the consistency of the tradition across centuries of Tibetan culture is striking. In Turkey, in the landscape where Göbekli Tepe sits, where the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth was built and then deliberately buried, the ancient Anatolian traditions speak of a race of primordial beings who shaped the landscape before the arrival of ordinary humans, who built the great stone structures, who understood the stars and the earth in ways that have not been recovered, and who disappeared at some unspecified point in the deep past, leaving only their works behind. Those works are still being excavated. In Greece, the memory of the giants is preserved in one of the most elaborate and sophisticated mythological traditions in the world. The Titans, the primordial beings who preceded the Olympian gods, were enormous, world-shaping, so powerful that their defeat required the collective effort of all the Olympian gods combined, assisted by the hero Heracles. And even then the battle, the Titanomachy, lasted 10 years. The defeated Titans were not destroyed. They were imprisoned, bound in Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, where they remain, according to tradition, to this day, imprisoned, not dead. And then there was a Gigantomachy, a separate battle, later than the Titanomachy, in which a race of giants rose from the earth and challenged the Olympian order. These giants were born from the blood of the wounded sky god Uranus falling upon the earth, a detail that, if you have been listening carefully tonight, will resonate with familiar mythological patterns. Divine blood mixing with the earth, producing something neither fully divine nor fully earthly. something powerful and dangerous and ultimately incompatible with the established order. The Olympians defeated the giants, but the method of defeat is interesting. The giants could not be killed by gods alone. They could only be killed by a combination of a god and a mortal hero working together, which required the gods to seek out and recruit human partners for the battle, to acknowledge, in the most concrete possible way, that they needed humanity in order to accomplish what they could not accomplish alone. The gods and humans needed each other, as they always have. In Scandinavia, the Norse tradition gives us the Jotnar, the giants or the ancient ones, who existed before the gods and who exist alongside the gods in a state of perpetual creative tension. The world of Norse mythology is not a world of good gods and evil monsters. It is a world of competing enormous forces, all of them flawed, all of them capable of both creation and destruction, all of them bound together in a cosmic drama that ends, according to Norse, in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The final battle, in which almost everything is destroyed and a new world is born from the wreckage of the old. Sound familiar? The Norse knew, as all these cultures knew, that the world runs in cycles, that ages of great power and great corruption are followed by catastrophic resets, that the reset is not the end. It is the turning of a wheel, and that after destruction, something new grows from the ruins. In Mexico and Central America, the Aztec tradition describes 5 successive suns, 5 successive ages of the world, each ending in catastrophe and each giving way to a new creation. The age that preceded our own, the 4th sun, ended in a great flood. The people of that age were turned into fish. And the 5th sun, our age, was created at Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, in an act of divine sacrifice. The giants of the previous ages are remembered in the Aztec tradition as the Quinametzin, enormous beings who built the great cities of the ancient world, who constructed the pyramids and the temples, who shaped the landscape of Mesoamerica before the current age of humanity began. The pyramids of Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, are among the most massive structures ever built by human hands. The Pyramid of the Sun contains more material by volume than any pyramid in Egypt. It is aligned to astronomical phenomena with a precision that implies sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. And the tunnels beneath it, discovered in 2003 and still being explored today, descend into the earth in ways that suggest a relationship between the structure above and something beneath it that archaeologists are still trying to understand. Who built Teotihuacan? The honest answer is that we do not know. The city was already ancient and abandoned when the Aztecs arrived and named it the City of the Gods. The Aztecs themselves believed it had been built by giants, by the Quinametzin, by the beings of the previous age. And in South America, the story continues. The ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, sitting at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level on the Altiplano, the high plain between the Andes ranges, represent another construction achievement that defies easy explanation. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, transported from quarries kilometers away, fitted together with precision so extraordinary that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. The H blocks of Puma Punku, interlocking stone pieces of such geometrical complexity and such machine precision that mainstream archaeology still cannot fully explain how they were produced with the tools supposedly available at the time of construction. The oral traditions of the indigenous Aymara people of the region say, simply, the gods built it, the giants built it, the beings of the previous age, who had knowledge and power that we have not recovered. And across the Pacific, in the islands of Polynesia, on Easter Island with its enormous stone heads, in Hawaii with its traditions of the Menehune, in the Marquesas with its descriptions of primordial beings of great stature, the memory persists. Different islands, different languages, different specific details. The same essential story. There were giants. They were here. They built things we cannot explain. And then they were gone. Or, and this is a question that keeps me awake, mostly gone, because the Tibetan monks speak of them in the present tense. And the Paiute tradition said they were burned alive in a cave, not that they died out naturally. And the Torah said the Israelites hunted them city by city, valley by valley, which implies that without that act of hunting, some of them might have survived. The world remembers the giants with a consistency and a specificity that goes far beyond the ordinary persistence of myth. Every culture, every continent, every tradition, the same height, the same power, the same hunger, the same eventual conflict with ordinary humanity, the same catastrophic end that was somehow, in some places, not quite complete. The global memory is not mythology. It is testimony. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of all those traditions settle around you. The Sanskrit epics and the Norse sagas and the Aztec codices and the Tibetan mountain traditions and the Paiute oral histories, all of them pointing in the same direction, all of them saying the same thing in different languages. We were not alone. And perhaps, in the high caves of mountains we do not climb, in the deep valleys where no roads go, in the places where the ancient world left its heaviest footprints and modern civilization has not yet reached, perhaps we are still not. One chapter remains, and it is the one that brings all of this home. We have come a long way together tonight, from the summit of Mount Hermon, where 200 watchers made their oath beneath a sky full of stars, through the world of Nephilim, magnificent and terrible, brilliant and insatiable, through the pre-flood civilization that reached extraordinary heights and then consumed itself from within, through the waters that came to reset everything, through the caves of Nevada and the burial mounds of Ohio and the archive rooms of Washington, D.C., through the memories of India and Greece and Tibet and Mesoamerica and Polynesia. Every culture on Earth pointing at the same vanished world, the same lost beings, the same catastrophe that divided history into before and after. And now we arrive at the final question. Not what happened then, but what it means now, because I have been circling something all night, something that I think you have already felt, even if you have not quite put it into words. A recognition, a familiarity, a sense that the story we have been telling is not entirely in the past, that something about it lives in the present, that the world the ancient text described, the world of insatiable power and systematic exploitation and consumed resources and oppressed populations, is not entirely gone. It just changed its clothes. Listen to the language we use today. We call the largest and most powerful corporations giants. We call their founders and owners titans, a word borrowed directly from Greek mythology, from the primordial beings whose war with the gods shook the foundations of the ancient world. We talk about industry titans and media giants and financial behemoths. We use the language of mythology unconsciously, instinctively, because something deep in our collective memory recognizes a pattern even when our conscious minds do not. The pattern is this: a small number of beings with access to knowledge and technology that the general population does not possess use that advantage to position themselves at the top of a hierarchy. From that position, they extract the resources of the earth and the labor of ordinary people with an efficiency and a thoroughness that leaves nothing on the table. The wealth flows upward. The suffering flows downward. The natural world is consumed at a rate it cannot sustain. And the people at the bottom of the pyramid, the ones whose labor produces everything and who receive the least of what they produce, are kept in a state of just enough to survive, not enough to question, not enough to resist. The Book of Enoch said the giants ate everything and were still not satisfied. Tell me that does not sound like the world you woke up in this morning. The Quran, in a passage I find extraordinarily powerful in this context, speaks directly to this pattern. It says, "Have they not traveled through the earth and seen what was the end of those who lived before them? They were stronger than these people. They cultivated the earth more and left deeper marks on it. Their messengers came to them with clear evidence. God did not wrong them. They wronged themselves." And then it says something that stops me every time. We gave them ears and eyes and hearts. But their ears and eyes and hearts were of no benefit to them at all, because they used them to deny the truth. And what they used to mock completely engulfed them. They mocked the idea that their civilization could fall. They mocked the warnings. They mocked the messengers who told them that what they were building was unsustainable, that what they were doing to the earth and each other was going to catch up with them, that the cycle had a direction, and that direction was toward collapse. They mocked the way powerful people always mock warnings, with the easy confidence of those who have never personally experienced consequences, who have always been protected from the results of their own actions by the buffer of wealth and power and institutional insulation. And then the flood came. I am not predicting a flood. I am not standing at the end of this long night's journey and telling you that the waters are rising and the end is near and you should be afraid. Fear is not what these ancient texts are trying to produce in us. If fear were the point, the stories would end with a flood and nothing after. But they don't. They always, every single tradition, without exception, include what comes after. The survivor, the new world, the olive branch, the rainbow, the fifth sun rising over Teotihuacan, Vishnu's avatar emerging from the waters with the Vedic scriptures saved, the world washed clean in the slow, difficult, beautiful work of beginning again. The ancient texts are not horror stories. They are warning stories. And there's a profound difference. A horror story says this is what happened, and it was terrible, and there was nothing to be done. A warning story says this is what happened, and here's why. And here's the pattern. And if you can see the pattern clearly enough and early enough, you have a chance to do something different. The question is whether we are seeing it. Because here's what I believe. After spending so much time with these stories, after following a thread from Mount Hermon to Lovelock Cave to the Denisova Cave to the storage rooms of the Smithsonian to the ruins of Tiwanaku, I believe the ancient texts are not primarily about giants. The giants are the vehicle, the delivery mechanism for a message that is ultimately about something else entirely. They are about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. The Watchers had knowledge, extraordinary, advanced, celestial knowledge, and they gave it to beings, first to humans, then through their children to the Nephilim, who did not yet have the wisdom to use it responsibly. And that gap between the level of knowledge available and the level of wisdom present produced everything that followed: the exploitation, the violence, the consumption, the corruption, the flood. We are living in that gap right now. Think about what the last 100 years have given us. Nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, the internet and mass surveillance, genetic engineering and biological warfare, artificial intelligence and autonomous killing machines. We have, in the span of a single century, acquired knowledge that would look like the magic of the Watchers to any previous generation of humans. We can split the atom. We can edit the genome. We can build machines that think. We can communicate instantaneously with any person anywhere on the planet. And we are still arguing about whether the people who live downstream from our factories deserve clean water. The knowledge has outrun the wisdom. Again, this is what the story of the Nephilim is really about. Not monsters, not horror, not ancient history, safely sealed off in the present by thousands of years of distance. It is about us. It is about the permanent human temptation to acquire power faster than we acquire capacity to use it well. To reach for the fruit before we understand what the tree is for. To build the tower before we know why we are building it or where it's supposed to reach. The Watchers descended from their mountain and shared their knowledge and had their children and changed the world forever. And the world they changed became, eventually, uninhabitable. Not because knowledge is evil, not because power is inherently corrupting, but because knowledge without accountability, power without responsibility, advancement without the corresponding development of the inner life. These things produce, inevitably, a world that consumes itself. And the universe, it seems, has a mechanism for dealing with worlds that consume themselves. It has always had that mechanism. The flood is not always water. Sometimes it is fire. Sometimes it is ice. Sometimes it is a slow collapse of civilization so thoroughly corrupted that it can no longer sustain its own complexity and simply falls apart from within, like a building whose foundations have been eaten away so gradually that no one noticed until the walls began to crack. The specific form of the reset matters less than the principle it embodies. When the balance tips too far, the balance corrects itself. This is not mysticism. This is physics. Systems that move too far from equilibrium either return to equilibrium or they collapse. The Earth is a system. Human civilization is a system. And systems have limits that are real and non-negotiable regardless of whether the beings operating within them choose to acknowledge those limits. The Nephilim did not acknowledge the limits, and the world was flooded. So, what do we do with all of this? What do you do, lying here in the dark, at the end of a very long journey through the oldest and strangest corridors of human memory? What does it mean to know that this story exists, that it has always existed, that has been told and retold and preserved across thousands of years and dozens of cultures precisely because the people who carried it understood that it needed to be heard by the people who came after. I think it means we listen, not with fear, with attention, with the kind of serious, clear-eyed attention that a warning deserves. Because the people who buried the story of the giants did not bury it because it was irrelevant. They buried it because it was too relevant. Because a population that understands a pattern, that can see the Nephilim and the titans of industry, that can recognize the pre-flood civilization and the civilization they are currently living in, is a population that is much harder to keep at the bottom of the pyramid. Knowledge is power. The Watchers knew it. The Nephilim used it. The institutions that locked the bones away understood it. And the ancient scribes who preserved these stories in the face of every effort to suppress them understood it too. Perhaps most deeply of all, they kept writing. They kept copying. They kept telling the stories around fires and carving them into stone and whispering them to their children in the dark, so that you, lying here tonight, thousands of years later, could hear them. The giants walked this earth. They filled it with their power and their hunger and their magnificent, terrible presence. They built things we cannot explain and new things we have not recovered and left marks on the landscape that we are still, slowly, finding. And then, mostly, they were gone, swept away by waters that were sent to reset a world that had forgotten what it was for. But they left something behind. Not their bones, though those are there too, in the dark of institutional storage, waiting for a reckoning that may or may not come in our lifetime. They left us the memory. The 200-year oral tradition of the Paiute people carried faithfully across generations until Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins wrote it down in English and said, "This is not a story. This is history. The Book of Enoch, hidden from the official canon of Scripture, preserved in the mountains of Ethiopia by monks who understood they were guarding something important. The Vedic text, memorized word for word by scholars across hundreds of generations with precision that modern linguists consider one of the greatest feats of oral preservation in human history. The myths of Greece and Sumer and Egypt and Mesoamerica and Polynesia, all of them carry within their symbolic language the same essential testimony. We were here. This happened. Learn from it. The question is not whether the story is true. At this point, after everything we have explored tonight, I think that question has been sufficiently answered. The question is what we do with the truth. Whether we file it away in the institutional dark the way the Smithsonian filed away the bones, or whether we take it out into the light and look at it honestly and ask ourselves what it is asking of us. What would a world look like that had actually learned from the story of the Nephilim? A world in which the people with the most knowledge were also the people with the most accountability. A world in which the resources of the earth were understood as a trust rather than a commodity, something to be stewarded rather than consumed. A world in which power was understood not as an end in itself, but as a responsibility. A world in which the gap between knowledge and wisdom was recognized as the most dangerous gap of all, and the closing of that gap was treated as the most urgent project of civilization. That is the world the ancient texts are asking us to build, not because God will flood us if we don't, not because the giants will return, but because the alternative, continuing down the path that the Nephilim walked, accumulating knowledge and power without the corresponding development of wisdom and accountability, leads somewhere we have already been, somewhere that ended badly, somewhere that the entire memory of our species has been trying to warn us away from for as long as we had language to carry the warning in. The flood came once. The world began again, and we are that new beginning. We are the descendants of the survivors, of Noah and Utnapishtim, and Manu and Deucalion, and every other figure who stepped out of their vessel onto mud of a washed world and looked at the empty horizon and chose to start again. Their blood is our blood. Their resilience is our inheritance. Their second chance is the world we were born into. What we do with it is still being decided. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of the whole story settle around you like the gentlest of floods. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that cleans. Let the giants recede into the deep past where they belong, enormous and strange and fascinating and gone. Let the waters go back to wherever waters go when the story is over. You are lying in a world that was rebuilt from almost nothing by people who survived something almost unsurvivable, who carried a memory through the darkest of times so that it would not be lost. And tonight you heard it. The story has been told. The warning has been given. And now, at last, it is time to sleep. Close your eyes. The flood has passed. The morning is coming. And the world, as it always does after the darkest nights, is going to be here when you wake up. Whether it resembles the world the ancient texts warn us about, or the world they hope we might one day build, that part, my friend, is entirely up to us. Good night. Sleep well. And remember what you heard tonight.